Off duty, he carries arms. He does not walk in the streets alone. Imagine yourself in his shoes. And yet he finds time to look down on Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. That is the British Tommy's life in Palestine today. We salute him.
It was all very well for Britain now to be fed up with the Palestine situation, but Britain had largely created the problem in the first place. In 1917, the British government had offered the Jews a national home in the land of Palestine, while ignoring the fact that Palestinian Arabs already lived there. In the Balfour Declaration, the British guaranteed not to prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing communities in Palestine. In 1947, the overstretched government in London decided to pass the problem on to the newly formed United Nations.
Committee of the United Nations Assembly, the British intention of relinquishing the Palestine mandate was stated by the Colonial Secretary, Mr. Creech Jones.
His Majesty's government have determined to base their policy on the assumption that they must lay down the mandate, under which they have sought for 25 years to discharge their obligations to fulfill the growth of the Jewish national home and to protect the interests of the Arab population. In order that there may be no misunderstanding of the attitude and policy of Britain, I have been instructed by His Majesty's government to announce with all solemnity that they have consequently decided that in the absence of a settlement, they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
The United Nations were just as much at a loss as to what to do about Palestine as the British government had been. There was sympathy for the Jewish cause, but there was concern that an Arab population should be made to leave their lands so that the State of Israel could be established. Eventually, the UN proposed a plan to partition Palestine.
At Flushing, Long Island, the General Assembly of the United Nations has made its decision on Palestine. The map shows what partition means. The Jewish state colored light, the Arab state dark, Jaffa to go to the Arabs, Jerusalem internationalized. There was heated debate in the Assembly. Senor Aranha of Brazil, presiding, calls on the nations to vote and announces how they vote.
The resolution of the Dutch Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
In December 1947, the partition plan was voted on.
And this was the scene next day in Jerusalem. The Jewish people at once began to celebrate the United Nations decision. If they got all they wanted, they had at least gained the verdict for the setting up of a new Jewish state. The Arab reaction was to follow. 2 days later, this was the typical scene. Arabs advancing on the center of Jerusalem at the beginning of a 3-day strike and an orgy of wrecking, looting and bloodshed. Isolated police were more or less powerless to deal with the riot, which beginning as a demonstration quickly led to the burning of Jewish shops and the general destruction of Jewish property. Fires were soon blazing in many places throughout Jerusalem. The burning of the wrecked cinema is typical. The implementing of the United Nations decision is the big query. Meanwhile, Britain announces the ending of her mandate next May.
So in 1948, the land of Palestine became the State of Israel. The cinema news coverage we've seen in this programme compared the British view of events with those of the US pro-Zionist view. There was no Arab perspective recorded on film in the 1940s because there was no developed Arab cinema industry in the region at the time. This means that the Palestinian Arabs are relatively invisible on the film record. But it doesn't mean that they weren't there, or that they didn't have a viewpoint. They simply had little or no access to film.